Professor Gigi Foster, great to see you again. Do I call you Professor or just Gigi?
Either one is fine.
But never call you late, isn't that right? Hey, look, just before we get into this, I'm amazed that you're still alive after watching you on the Australian ABC Q&A. You got out alive. Thank goodness they didn't have a big audience. That's all I can say.
I don't mind being the only Christian in a bunch of lions. It's important to have both sides of the debate represented. So I feel it's a public service to do that sort of thing, and I can take the heat. So it should, I'm happy to do it.
Do you think there's a serious restriction of debate in this country over government management of COVID-19 or both together? It just seems to shut you down. If you mention anything to do with the economy, then you're an evil person. And then if you mention all things about how we're going to keep everybody alive, then you're Joan of Arc. And from the Q&A, you weren't that one, at least.
Very much so. I've gotten a lot of emails and messages since my recent appearances on national TV from people who basically say, we agree with you, but we don't feel comfortable agreeing with those kinds of views or putting those kinds of views out in public. All that happens is around our dinner table, we exchange these opinions sort of secretively, furtively. It gives me sort of an impression that people are operating as they may have done in occupied France. It's sort of, we can't be seen to be not towing this line, and so we have to keep it to ourselves. And I think that's very damaging for the quality of public debate and the ability of our institutions to deliver actually the best policy for Australia, because everything has become about towing the right line, going along with the crowd, and that's not the way to make policy for people. And so it's been very troubling. I've not seen really any other public figures who will be willing to go on public television and national television and say the kinds of things I've been saying, but I think many people are thinking them. I don't know whether it's a silent majority, but it's an increasingly large fraction of Australians who are thinking these thoughts and just don't feel comfortable saying them.
Except for the medical, have any aspects of the management of COVID-19 been data-driven?
Well, the first time I was on ABC Q&A in April, I actually asked that question of Joni McVernon, saying, is it true that the only thing driving policy at the start of this was the epidemiological modeling and that economic costs were not considered? And she essentially admitted that they hadn't considered the economic costs. So I think that, yes, there's a whole swath of data and evidence about what shutting down the economy does to people, and specifically what the measures we've taken have done to people. So social distancing and the blocking of borders and all the various different measures we've taken. And not just in Australia are these data now available. I mean, many countries have had similar kinds of restrictions, and they've lived in this sort of hysteria, this fear-based kind of environment for a while. And so we can use their data on what's happened to their populations to infer what might have been happening here, even if we've not been collecting the data properly. So, inevitably at the start of a very uncertain environment, which is what we were facing in March, you do have to rely on models more than data. We have some data, but you also have to project forward using assumptions. And ideally, the scientific method dictates that you confront those models that you initially use with data as that data arises, as it becomes available, as you live through the crisis. And that's what we've not done here. And that's been very troubling to me, because again, it shows a lack of adaptability of our policy to the actual needs of the circumstance.
So why do we have so few options? Shut down or not shutting it down? What do you suggest? What should we do to get through this, say, for the betterment of the economy?
Well, I think in this, as in many other policy settings, what we should do is look at the data on where the threat really is, and then tailor our response to the parts of the population, the sectors, the areas, the times when there is highest vulnerability. And we know in the case of this virus that it is particularly virulent in regard to older people, right? Even in some place like Sweden, fewer than 300 people under the age of 50 have died of this thing. right? So it is really mainly claiming older people. And I know that it can infect younger people, but the statistics don't lie. And this is one of the things I've noticed in the debate. If you can cite a statistic, frequently people will come back with an anecdote, right?
Mm.
Oh, but I know a 25-year-old. Yeah, okay, sure. So, occasionally there's a woman who's 6'5". That doesn't negate the fact that most women are shorter than men, right? Than most men, right? It's sort of an averages versus an anecdote kind of thing. So if we think about those data on death rates by age and death rates by morbidity status, by immunocompromised status, then it tells us that where we should be focusing our efforts is on protecting our vulnerable, protecting the elderly, protecting the people who have immune problems. And that means looking overseas to see what has been done in places like Florida, in places like Sweden, which did make mistakes early on in terms of not protecting the elderly as well as they could. And they suffered a lot of deaths in old age homes, unfortunately, because of those mistakes. But they've now learned. We should be on the phone to people in Sweden, on the phone to people in Florida, saying what works, what tactics, what methods, what can we do to creatively protect those portions of the population that really are at serious risk of this thing, for whom COVID-19 is a far greater risk than an average flu or an average, disease of any sort that causes pneumonia and lung infection, and then allow everybody else to get back to work, get back to their activities in the way that they feel safe doing that. And of course, because of the fear, we're going to have lesser participation in various areas of the economy by some people. But by and large, if we at least allow people to start making their own decisions at the coalface about what's best for them, and then have strong recommendations in regard to the vulnerable, that is a more proportionate response than this blanket lockdown.
You mentioned Florida, for example. Florida is now the epicenter for coronavirus or COVID-19 throughout the US. In the East, in Asia, for example, South Korea as an example, they couldn't do enough to make sure that all the data was there and that the facts were on hand for all the experts. Whereas in the West, we have this sort of a blasé sort of thing, don't we? Where, parties were happening and the virus spread. Do you think maybe our cultural difference is part of the problem also in not eradicating, but just living and controlling to our best extent COVID-19?
Well, I think there are a couple things to say about that. The first is that when somebody gets a message from the government that they don't believe, because it's not actually data-based, it's not actually evidence-driven, they're not actually told why the policy setting is what it is, over time, those kinds of messages, they erode people's confidence in what the government is saying. And it's going to make them angrier and more frustrated, and they are going to lash out. Which is kind of understandable. If somebody keeps telling you to do something that is not the best way to deal with a threat or deal with a situation that you're facing, then you kind of lose respect for the source of the message, right? And that makes you more likely to be hostile against any request that source of the message makes of you later on. And so that really doesn't help when the Australian government, essentially treats people like babies, like they don't have brains, and they have to be, scared into taking extreme actions, which actually haven't been proven to, in fact, be the right way to handle this crisis. And people's confidence in the government then will erode. And so it may erupt in those kinds of violation behaviors. The second thing to say is that I'm much more worried about deaths and extreme symptomology, which is correlated with deaths, than I am about infection counts, for a number of reasons. First of all, infection counts, of course, we know are a function of the testing regime, and testing regimes differ depending on the locale. So how many people you end up thinking are infected will differ greatly across regions just because of the testing regime being different. And secondly, we know that in many other infectious diseases, infection, if it doesn't lead to serious symptoms or death, can develop some level of immunoresponse in the infected individual. Now, we don't know how long that lasts, and we have all sorts of uncertainty about that. But it may be that infecting younger people and then, releasing them back to the wild is actually a viable strategy as a defense for the more vulnerable population in the long run. And we do see in Sweden right now, for example, with those death counts coming down to 1 or 2 per day, they seem to have developed some sort of an equilibrium where they're not seeing, that nasty rise in deaths that they were seeing before. So it may not be herd immunity, but it's some combination of the settings they've got in terms of their responses, hand washing, distancing, whatever, and what's happened immunologically in their population that have delivered for them an effective scenario where the virus isn't as dangerous. And that's what we'd like to have here in Australia.
So where do you see Victoria being once the 6 weeks or 8 weeks have gone on this COVID-19 shutdown? How will the economy be?
I don't have a crystal ball there, but we've certainly seen projections of GDP declines for Australia that are 5-6%, something like that. And I would definitely expect that, obviously, Victoria is a very important contributor, particularly in the area of higher education. You've got a lot of universities over there. And as I mentioned on Q&A recently, we don't have an end game here that the universities can look at or the international tourism industry can look at and say, oh, okay, by that point, at least we'll be able to let some people in and continue to do our business. And so we are really, if we don't open those borders, at some point in the next 6 to 12 months anyway, we are going to have a completely restructured higher education sector, a totally restructured tourism sector. These sectors, which are, Victoria contributes to a lot, are going to be massively hit. And again, I don't think people are really thinking about those effects, which are just logical. They're just logical effects. And instead, what we get is this notion of, oh, well, this is our chance to reform Australia and pursue a different industrial structure and whatnot. Well, some of that might be a good idea, and I think there are some opportunities to do some positive things for the country. But the idea that we should stab our international education and international tourism industries in the stomach on the altar of protection from COVID-19, I think is extremely short-sighted, very blinkered. We have comparative advantages in those areas. And if we give those advantages up and we just say, well, forget it, we're not going to invest so much in that, it puts us on a different position in relation to all the other countries. And Asia as a whole will look at us very differently. If we're not able to provide education in English language, Western environments, which is one of the big comparative advantages that we have here in Asia, I don't like to think about what it's going to look like. I mean, I'm not sure that we'll have the pulling power to actually get really highly educated international scholars to come here because, we're not going to have the money and the interest in the international links.